Maria Santos clutched her worn leather tool bag as she walked through the massive hangar doors at Edwards Air Force Base. The California desert sun blazed overhead, but inside the climate-controlled facility, the air was crisp and filled with the scent of jet fuel and metal polish. Her steel-toed boots echoed against the polished concrete floor as she took in the sight before her. Rows of the most advanced fighter jets in the world sat like sleeping giants. F-35 Lightning aircraft stretched across the hangar floor, their sleek gray bodies gleaming under the bright fluorescent lights. Each one represented millions of dollars of cutting-edge technology and years of engineering excellence. Maria had dreamed of working on these machines since she was a little girl watching planes fly over her neighborhood in East Los Angeles. At 26, Maria was finally here, but she could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on her as she made her way to the assignment desk. The other mechanics and technicians barely looked up from their work, but she caught the subtle glances, the quick whispers between colleagues. She was used to it by now. In a field dominated by men, especially in military aviation, she had learned to let her work speak louder than their doubts. "You must be Santos," called out a gruff voice from behind a metal desk covered in work orders and coffee-stained paperwork. Sergeant First Class Mike stood up, his massive frame casting a shadow over the cluttered workspace. His weathered hands and oil-stained uniform told the story of 30 years working on military aircraft. "Welcome to the real world, rookie." Maria extended her hand for a firm handshake. "Thank you, Sergeant. I'm ready to get started." Looked down at her tool bag with barely concealed amusement. The leather was cracked and worn, held together in places with electrical tape. It had belonged to her grandfather, who had worked as a mechanic in small-town garages his whole life. Inside were tools that had been passed down through 3 generations of her family, mixed with newer equipment she had acquired during her training at technical school. "That's quite a collection you've got there," said, his tone suggesting it was anything but impressive. "Hope you've got more than just sentimental value in that bag." Several other mechanics had gathered around now, curious to see the new addition to their team. There was Tommy, a specialist who had been working on F-35s for 3 years and took pride in his speed at routine maintenance tasks. Next to him stood Williams, whose father had been a pilot in the Gulf War and who considered himself the unofficial historian of military aviation at the base. Behind them, Sarah Mitchell leaned against a tool cart, the only other woman on the team, but one who had earned her place through 5 years of flawless service records. "Santos, right?" Tommy said, looking her up and down. "Where did you train? Some community college program?" "Phoenix Technical Institute," Maria replied evenly. "Top of my class in aircraft systems and electronics." Laughed, but not in a particularly mean way. "School is one thing, sweetheart. These birds are a whole different level. We're talking about systems so complex that some of our guys with 10 years' experience still call in specialists for certain problems." Sarah stepped forward, offering a more welcoming smile. "Don't mind them. Everyone's a little territorial around here, but is right about the complexity. These jets have over 8 million lines of computer code. The avionics alone would make your head spin." Picked up a work order from his desk and handed it to Maria. "Speaking of which, here's your first assignment. Aircraft tail number 125052 needs a routine inspection of the engine bay cooling systems. Should take you about 4 hours if you know what you're doing. Tommy here can show you the ropes." Tommy groaned audibly. "Sarge, I've got 3 other birds to prep for tomorrow's test flights. Can't she shadow someone else?" "She's your responsibility for the first week. Department policy for all new hires." Turned back to Maria. "Follows lead, ask questions when you need to, and try not to break anything expensive." As they walked toward the assigned aircraft, Maria could hear the conversations resuming behind them. She caught fragments of words, "diversity hire," "won't last a month," "probably never even seen a real engine before." She had heard it all before during her training, during her internship at a civilian aircraft maintenance facility, and even during the rigorous screening process to get this position. The F-35 Lightning that would be her first hands-on experience stood 20 feet away, its canopy open like the mouth of some futuristic beast. Up close, the aircraft was even more impressive than she had imagined. The skin was smooth to the touch, made of advanced composite materials that could withstand incredible stresses and temperatures. The single-engine intake gaped wide, leading to the most powerful engine ever installed in a fighter aircraft. "All right, rookie," Tommy said, opening his own well-organized tool case. First rule of working on these machines: everything is documented, everything is double-checked, and everything is done by the book. One mistake could ground this bird for weeks or worse, put a pilot in danger. Maria nodded, pulling out her grandfather's old socket wrench set from her worn tool bag. The tools were clean and well-maintained despite their age, each one placed exactly where it had been for the past 30 years. Tommy glanced at them with obvious skepticism. "Those look like they belong in a classic car restoration shop, not on a fifth-generation fighter jet," he commented. "You sure they're going to be accurate enough for this kind of precision work?" "They've never let my family down," Maria replied, running her fingers over the smooth wooden handle of a screwdriver her grandfather had carved himself. "Good tools are good tools, regardless of age." Tommy shrugged and began explaining the layout of the engine bay. The cooling system consisted of dozens of interconnected components, each one crucial to maintaining the proper temperature during the intense heat generated by supersonic flight. There were heat exchangers, coolant pumps, temperature sensors, and miles of tubing that snaked through the aircraft's frame like a circulatory system. As Tommy talked, Maria listened carefully but also studied the system with her own eyes. Her grandfather had taught her that every machine had its own personality, its own way of telling you what it needed. Even the most advanced computer-controlled systems followed basic mechanical principles that had been unchanged for decades. "The inspection checklist has 47 items," Tommy continued, pulling out a tablet computer loaded with the official maintenance software. "We check fluid levels, look for leaks, test sensor readings, inspect hose connections, and verify that all computer diagnostics are showing green across the board." They worked in relative silence for the first hour, with Tommy pointing out specific components and Maria taking notes on both the official checklist and her own small notebook. She noticed several things that seemed odd to her trained eye: tiny vibrations in certain hoses that suggested possible loose connections, slight discoloration on a heat exchanger that might indicate excessive temperature exposure, and a barely audible hum from one of the coolant pumps that sounded different from the others. "Tommy," she said, looking up from under the engine cowling, "this pump sounds like it might be developing bearing wear. Have you noticed any irregularities in its performance recently?" Tommy stopped what he was doing and listened for a moment. "Sounds fine to me. All the computer readings are normal. If there was a problem, the diagnostic systems would flag it immediately." Maria wanted to press the issue, but decided to focus on completing her first assignment without causing trouble. Over the next 2 hours, they methodically worked through the entire checklist, with Tommy occasionally testing her knowledge by asking her to identify specific components or explain how different systems interacted with each other. By the time they finished, word had spread through the hangar about the new mechanic with the antique tool bag. Small groups of technicians found excuses to walk past their work area, curious to see how the rookie was handling her first day on real military hardware. "Not bad for a first-timer," Tommy admitted as they closed up the engine bay and completed the final paperwork. "You definitely know your way around basic aircraft systems, but remember, book learning and real-world experience are two very different things." Maria packed her tools back into her grandfather's leather bag, each one returning to its designated spot. As she worked, she couldn't shake the feeling that the coolant pump issue she had noticed was more serious than Tommy believed. Her instincts, honed by years of working on everything from motorcycles to small aircraft, told her that the subtle changes in sound and vibration were early warning signs of a problem that could become catastrophic if left unaddressed. But she was the new person, the outsider with the old tools and the fresh diploma. Who was she to question the judgment of experienced technicians who had been working on these aircraft for years? As her first day came to an end, Maria walked back toward the parking lot, her tool bag slung over her shoulder. Behind her, the hangar buzzed with activity as the evening shift prepared for their duties. The F-35 sat in their designated spots, billion-dollar machines that represented the pinnacle of human engineering and technological achievement. Tomorrow, she would return and continue learning the intricacies of maintaining these incredible aircraft. She would prove that her skills were more important than her background, that her dedication could overcome any doubts about her qualifications. But tonight, as she drove home through the desert landscape, she couldn't stop thinking about that coolant pump and wondering if anyone would listen when she tried to voice her concerns. 3 weeks had passed since Maria's first day at Edwards Air Force Base. and she had settled into the rhythm of military aircraft maintenance. Each morning, she arrived 30 minutes before her shift started, using the quiet time to familiarize herself with the day's work orders and study the technical manuals that seemed to grow thicker with each aircraft modification. Her initial nervousness had given way to growing confidence as she mastered the complex procedures required to maintain the F-35 Lightning fleet. She had completed dozens of routine inspections, assisted with major component replacements, and even been trusted to work independently on some of the less critical systems. Her efficiency ratings were solid, and Sargent had stopped making comments about her unconventional tool collection. But the issue with the coolant pump on aircraft 125052 continued to gnaw at her. Every few days, when work assignments brought her back to that particular jet, she would listen carefully to the subtle sounds emanating from the engine bay. The irregular humming had become more pronounced, and she had noticed tiny metal particles in the coolant reservoir that suggested internal wear was accelerating. Each time she brought her concerns to Tommy or the other senior mechanics, they would pull up the computer diagnostics and show her the green status lights across all monitoring systems. The aircraft's sophisticated sensors showed normal operating temperatures, proper fluid pressures, and acceptable vibration levels. According to the official readings, there was absolutely nothing wrong with the cooling system. "Santos, you're overthinking this," said one afternoon as they completed a pre-flight inspection together. "These diagnostic systems are incredibly advanced. They can detect problems long before human senses would pick up anything unusual. If the computer says everything is fine, then everything is fine." Maria wiped her hands on a shop rag and closed her grandfather's tool case thoughtfully. "I understand that, but what if the sensors aren't calibrated to detect this particular type of wear pattern? What if the problem is developing in a way that falls outside the normal parameters?" Sarah, who was working on the adjacent aircraft, looked up from her own tasks. "Maria, I appreciate your attention to detail, I really do, but you have to trust the systems. These jets have multiple redundant safety features. Even if one component started to fail, there are backups and warnings that would activate long before any real danger occurred." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Captain Jennifer Hayes, the squadron's maintenance officer. At 34, Captain Hayes was a former F-35 pilot who had transitioned to the maintenance side after completing her flying tour. She understood both the technical requirements and the operational demands of keeping these aircraft mission-ready. "How are we looking for tomorrow's training exercises?" Captain Hayes asked, reviewing the status board that showed the readiness condition of each aircraft in the squadron. "All birds are green across the board," Sargent reported from his desk. "We've got 12 aircraft scheduled for various flight profiles, all within normal parameters for maintenance requirements." Captain Hayes nodded approvingly, then noticed Maria's thoughtful expression. "Something on your mind, Santos?" Maria hesitated for a moment, knowing that raising concerns about an aircraft that showed no official problems could be seen as questioning the competence of her more experienced colleagues. But her grandfather had taught her that speaking up about potential safety issues was always more important than avoiding uncomfortable conversations. "Ma'am, I've been monitoring aircraft 125052 over the past few weeks, and I believe there might be an emerging issue with the primary coolant pump. The diagnostic systems show normal operation, but I'm hearing sounds and seeing physical evidence that suggests the internal bearings are beginning to fail." Captain Hayes walked over to Maria's workstation and looked at the maintenance logs for the aircraft in question. "The computer shows all systems operating within normal parameters. What specific evidence are you referring to?" Maria pulled out her small notebook, where she had been documenting her observations despite the lack of official support for her concerns. "The pump is producing a harmonic vibration at approximately 2,800 RPM that wasn't present 3 weeks ago. I've also found microscopic metal particles in the coolant reservoir during the last 2 fluid checks, and the temperature differential between the input and output sides of the heat exchanger has increased by 3 degrees over the past week." The other mechanics had gathered around to listen to this exchange, their expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed annoyance. Tommy shook his head slightly and pulled up the aircraft's maintenance history on his tablet. "Captain, all of those measurements are still well within acceptable tolerances," he said. The diagnostic systems would flag any actual problems long before they became safety issues. Santos is a good mechanic, but she might be being a little too cautious for operational requirements. Captain Hayes studied the official readings for a few moments, then looked back at Maria. Santos, I appreciate your vigilance, and attention to detail is always important in this job. However, we have to balance caution with operational readiness. This aircraft is scheduled for a training mission tomorrow morning, and I can't ground a multi-million-dollar jet based on subjective observations that aren't supported by our monitoring systems. Maria felt her face flush with a mixture of embarrassment and frustration. She understood the captain's position from an operational standpoint, but she also couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something important. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her memory, reminding her that machines often gave subtle warnings long before catastrophic failures occurred. I understand, ma'am, she replied respectfully. Would it be possible to schedule additional monitoring of this aircraft during its flight tomorrow? If I'm right about the bearing wear, the increased stress of flight operations might accelerate the problem. The pilot will monitor all systems during the flight, and will have telemetry data streaming back to the maintenance team in real time, Captain Hayes said. If any abnormalities develop, we'll know about them immediately. As the group dispersed to continue their afternoon duties, Sarah approached Maria with a sympathetic expression. Listen, I know this is frustrating. When I first started here, I questioned everything too. But you have to learn to trust the experience of the people around you and the reliability of these monitoring systems. Maria nodded, understanding that Sarah was trying to be helpful, but she couldn't let the matter rest entirely. That evening, after her official shift had ended, she returned to the hangar using her security clearance for after-hours access. The vast space was quieter now, with only a skeleton crew of night shift personnel maintaining security and handling any emergency maintenance issues. Aircraft 125052 sat in its designated spot, looking identical to the 11 other F-35s lined up around the hangar. Maria approached it quietly, carrying only a small flashlight and a basic set of tools. She wasn't planning to perform any unauthorized maintenance, but she wanted to conduct a more thorough examination of the cooling system without the pressure of skeptical colleagues watching her every move. Working carefully in the dim light, she opened the engine bay access panels and listened closely to the subtle sounds of the aircraft systems. Even with the engines shut down, various pumps and monitoring systems continued to operate, maintaining proper conditions throughout the aircraft's complex mechanical systems. The coolant pump's irregular vibration was definitely more pronounced than it had been a week ago. Maria placed her hand gently on the pump housing and felt the slight roughness in its operation that indicated bearing wear. She also noticed that the coolant reservoir level had dropped slightly more than would be expected from normal thermal expansion and contraction cycles. Most troubling of all, when she used her flashlight to examine the area around the pump, she found tiny droplets of coolant that had been dispersed by the vibration. The amount was minimal, barely visible, but it suggested that internal seals were beginning to be affected by the bearing problems. Maria documented everything in her notebook, taking careful measurements and noting the exact time and conditions of her observations. She knew that her after-hours investigation might be viewed unfavorably by her supervisors, but she also felt a responsibility to ensure that every aircraft under her care was as safe as possible. As she prepared to close up the access panels, she heard footsteps approaching across the hangar floor. Williams emerged from the shadows, carrying a coffee cup and wearing the casual expression of someone conducting a routine security walkthrough. Santos, what are you doing here so late? He asked, though his tone was more curious than accusatory. Just double-checking some measurements on the cooling system, she replied honestly. I wanted to make sure I wasn't missing anything obvious. Set down his coffee and joined her near the aircraft. You're really concerned about this, aren't you? I am, Maria said simply. I know everyone thinks I'm being overly cautious, but my instincts are telling me that this pump is going to fail. Maybe not today or tomorrow, but soon. And when it does, it could put the pilot in serious danger. Was quiet for a long moment, considering her words. He had been working on military aircraft for 8 years and had seen his share of unexpected failures. While he generally trusted the diagnostic systems, he also knew that machines could be unpredictable in ways that computers couldn't always anticipate. What exactly do you think is going to happen? He asked. Maria pointed to the coolant pump with her flashlight. Best case scenario, the bearings seize gradually and the pump stops working during ground operations. Worst case, the bearings fail catastrophically during high-stress flight conditions, causing coolant loss, overheating, and possible engine damage or fire. And you think this could happen during tomorrow's training flight? I think the probability increases with every hour of operation, Maria said. The stress of takeoff, high-speed maneuvering, and landing cycles will accelerate whatever wear process is already occurring. Studied the pump housing that Maria had been examining, though he didn't have her trained ear for detecting subtle mechanical irregularities. After a few minutes, he straightened up and looked at her with a more serious expression. Santos, if you're really this concerned, you need to document everything officially and request a formal inspection. It's one thing to have doubts, but if you believe there's a genuine safety risk, you have an obligation to follow the proper procedures. Maria knew he was right, but she also knew that requesting a formal inspection based on her observations would be seen as a direct challenge to the judgment of her more experienced colleagues. It would mark her as a troublemaker, someone who didn't trust the systems and procedures that had been developed over years of operation. But as she looked at the aircraft that would carry a pilot into the sky tomorrow morning, she realized that her reputation was far less important than ensuring that everyone came home safely. "You're right," she said, closing her notebook and gathering her tools. "I'll submit a formal request first thing in the morning." As they walked back toward the hangar exit together, Maria felt the weight of the decision she had just made. Tomorrow would bring either vindication of her concerns or confirmation that she was indeed being overly cautious. Either way, there would be no going back from the choice to challenge the established order. The next morning arrived with the kind of crystal-clear desert sky that made Edwards Air Force Base perfect for flight testing. Maria arrived at the hangar an hour earlier than usual, her formal inspection request carefully prepared and ready to submit to Captain Hayes. The document detailed all of her observations about aircraft 125052, complete with timestamps, measurements, and her professional assessment of the potential risks. But when she reached the maintenance office, she discovered that the morning's flight schedule had been moved up by 2 hours due to favorable weather conditions. Captain Hayes was already in the pre-flight briefing room with the pilots, and aircraft 125052 was being prepared for departure as part of a formation training exercise involving 4 F-35s. "Santos," Sergeant called out from across the hangar. "Where's your inspection request? Captain Hayes said you had some concerns about 5052. Maria hurried over to desk, her heart racing as she watched the ground crew conducting final preparations on the aircraft in question. "Right here, Sergeant. I documented everything I've observed over the past 3 weeks regarding the coolant pump." Scanned the document quickly, his weathered face showing skepticism as he read through Maria's detailed observations. Around them, the hangar buzzed with the organized chaos of preparing multiple aircraft for simultaneous departure. Fuel trucks moved between the jets, ordnance specialists completed weapons system checks, and pilots conducted their walk-around inspections. "Santos, this is all very thorough, but you're asking me to ground a jet based on sounds and vibrations that aren't showing up on any of our monitoring equipment," said. "Do you understand what that means operationally?" "I understand it's a significant decision, Sergeant, but I believe the safety risk is real," Maria replied. "The bearing where I've documented is progressing faster than normal, and the stress of today's flight profile could push it past the failure point." Before could respond, Tommy approached them with a tablet displaying the pre-flight inspection results for aircraft 125052. "All systems green across the board," he reported. "Coolant levels normal, temperature readings nominal, pump pressure within specifications. Whatever Santos was hearing yesterday, it's not affecting actual performance." Maria felt her stomach tight as she realized that her formal concerns were being dismissed, just as her informal ones had been. She looked across the hangar at aircraft 125052, where Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Park was conducting her pilot's pre-flight inspection. Colonel Park was one of the most experienced F-35 pilots in the squadron, with over 2,000 flight hours in various military aircraft and a reputation for exceptional skill and judgment. "Sergeant, could I at least speak with Colonel Park about my concerns?" Maria asked. "As the pilot, she should be aware of any potential issues, even if they're not confirmed." Glanced at his watch and saw that the scheduled departure time was only 40 minutes away. The entire flight schedule was carefully coordinated to optimize airspace usage and training objectives. Delaying or canceling one aircraft would require significant adjustments to the day's operations. All right, Santos, you've got 5 minutes to brief the colonel, but make it quick and stick to the facts. Don't go scaring pilots with worst-case scenarios. Maria walked quickly across the hangar floor, dodging fuel lines and equipment carts as she made her way to aircraft 125052. Colonel Park was completing her inspection of the aircraft's external systems, checking control surfaces, weapons pylons, and sensor arrays with the methodical precision that had kept her alive through hundreds of combat and training missions. "Colonel Park," Maria called out as she approached. "I'm Airman Santos, one of the maintenance technicians assigned to this aircraft. Could I have a moment to discuss some observations I've made about the cooling system?" Colonel Park paused in her inspection and turned to face Maria. At 38, she was compact and athletic, with the kind of intense focus that came from years of making split-second decisions in high-stress environments. Her flight suit was immaculate, and her helmet bag was packed with the precision of someone who trusted her life to careful preparation. "What kind of observations?" Park asked, checking her watch while listening to Maria's response. Maria quickly summarized her concerns about the coolant pump bearing wear, the metal particles she had found, and the subtle changes in vibration and temperature that she had documented over the past 3 weeks. She kept her explanation factual and concise, knowing that pilots appreciated direct communication about mechanical issues. Colonel Park listened attentively, occasionally asking clarifying questions about specific symptoms or measurements. When Maria finished her briefing, the pilot was quiet for a moment, considering the information in the context of her own knowledge of aircraft systems and risk management. "Have you discussed these concerns with the maintenance supervisor and the squadron maintenance officer?" Park asked. "Yes, ma'am. The official position is that all diagnostic systems show normal operation, and the symptoms I've observed are within acceptable tolerances for continued flight operations." Park nodded, understanding the complex balance between operational requirements and safety considerations that defined military aviation. Every flight involved calculated risks, and pilots learned to distinguish between genuine threats and routine variations in aircraft performance. "Santos, I appreciate you bringing this to my attention directly," Park said. "I'll monitor the cooling system closely during the flight and abort the mission if I see any abnormal readings or symptoms. The aircraft has multiple backup systems and warning indicators, so if a problem develops, I'll know about it immediately." As Maria walked back toward the maintenance area, she felt a mixture of relief and continued anxiety. She had done everything she could within the established procedures to communicate her concerns, but the aircraft was still going to fly with what she believed was a potentially dangerous mechanical problem. The next hour passed in a blur of final preparations and system checks. The 4 F-35s scheduled for the training mission were towed out of the hangar and positioned on the flight line, their engines spooled up in sequence as the pilots completed their pre-flight procedures. The sound of jet engines warming up filled the air with a deep, powerful rumble that vibrated through the ground and into the bones of everyone nearby. Maria stood with the other maintenance personnel in the designated observation area, watching as Colonel Park and her wingmen taxied toward the runway. Through her binoculars, she could see the pilots conducting final instrument checks and receiving clearance from the control tower for departure. At exactly 8:47 hours, the first F-35 lifted off from the runway, its single engine producing 40,000 pounds of thrust as it climbed rapidly into the desert sky. The other 3 aircraft followed at 30-second intervals, their sleek forms quickly becoming small specks against the brilliant blue backdrop. "Beautiful sight," commented Williams, who was standing nearby with his own binoculars. "Never gets old watching those birds fly." Maria nodded absently, but her attention was focused on the radio communications between the pilots and ground control. The training mission called for high-speed maneuvering exercises, simulated combat scenarios, and precision formation flying, exactly the kind of high-stress operations that would put maximum strain on all aircraft systems. For the first 90 minutes of the flight, everything proceeded normally. The pilots reported successful completion of their training objectives, and telemetry data showed all aircraft performing within expected parameters. Maria began to wonder if her concerns had indeed been overly cautious, based more on anxiety about her new position than actual mechanical problems. Then, at 10:23 hours, Colonel Park's voice crackled over the radio with a tone that immediately caught everyone's attention. Edwards Control, Lightning 402. I'm showing elevated engine temperature readings and unusual vibrations in the cooling system, requesting vectors for immediate return to base. The maintenance team gathered around the radio communications station, listening intently as Park described the symptoms she was experiencing. The engine temperature was climbing steadily, despite normal throttle settings and environmental conditions. More concerning, the vibrations she mentioned matched exactly what Maria had been documenting for the past 3 weeks. Lightning 402, you are cleared direct Edwards, runway 22 left. Emergency equipment is standing by, the control tower responded. What is your current altitude and distance from base? Edwards Control, 402 is at 15,000 feet, approximately 40 miles northeast of the field. Engine temperature continuing to climb, now approaching red line limits. Maria felt her heart pounding as she listened to the unfolding emergency. This was exactly the scenario she had feared: catastrophic cooling system failure during high-stress flight operations, with a pilot's life hanging in the balance. Sergeant appeared at her side, his face grim as he monitored the situation. Santos, get your tools ready. When that bird lands, we're going to need every available person working on the cooling system. As if on cue, Colonel Park's voice returned over the radio, now with an edge of urgency that sent chills through everyone listening. Edwards Control, Lightning 402. Engine temperature has exceeded red line limits, and I'm getting multiple caution lights related to the cooling system. I need to get this bird on the ground immediately. The next 20 minutes were the longest of Maria's life. She listened to Colonel Park's steady, professional voice as she managed the emergency with the skill and composure that had made her one of the squadron's most respected pilots. Park reduced power to minimum levels, configured the aircraft for emergency landing, and worked through her emergency checklist while nursing the overheating engine through its final approach. When the F-35 finally appeared on the horizon, trailing a thin stream of vapor from its engine bay, Maria felt a mixture of vindication and horror. She had been right about the cooling system failure, but being right meant that a pilot's life had been put at risk by a problem that could have been prevented. The aircraft touched down smoothly despite its mechanical problems, and Colonel Park immediately shut down the engine as emergency crews surrounded the jet. Fire trucks positioned themselves around the aircraft, while medical personnel stood ready to assist the pilot if needed. As the canopy opened and Colonel Park climbed out unharmed, Maria grabbed her grandfather's tool bag and ran toward the aircraft. This was her moment to prove that her concerns had been valid, that her unconventional approach to aircraft maintenance could identify problems that sophisticated computer systems had missed. But more importantly, this was her chance to fix the problem that had nearly cost a pilot her life, using the skills and instincts that 3 generations of her family had passed down through a worn leather tool bag and a deep understanding of how machines really worked. Steam rose from the engine bay of aircraft 125052 as Maria approached with her tool bag, the acrid smell of overheated coolant and stressed metal filling the air around the aircraft. Colonel Park stood nearby, removing her helmet and flight gloves while debriefing with the emergency response team about the in-flight emergency she had just survived. Temperature peaked at 2,100 degrees before I could get the power back and start my descent, Park was explaining to Captain Hayes. Lost about 30% of cooling capacity in the final 10 minutes of flight. If I had been any further from the base, this could have gotten very ugly very quickly. Maria set down her tool bag and immediately began opening the engine bay access panels, her hands moving with practiced efficiency despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. Around her, other maintenance personnel were setting up diagnostic equipment and preparing to conduct a thorough analysis of the cooling system failure. Santos, Sergeant called out as he approached the aircraft. I need you to walk me through exactly what you observed over the past few weeks. Every detail, every measurement, everything that led you to predict this failure. As Maria began explaining her observations, Tommy and Williams gathered around to listen. Their earlier skepticism had been replaced by a mixture of curiosity and grudging respect for her diagnostic skills. Sarah Mitchell arrived with additional testing equipment, ready to support whatever repairs would be necessary. The bearing wear started as minor vibrations at specific RPM ranges, Maria explained as she carefully removed the coolant pump housing. Over time, the irregularities increased. Metal particles appeared in the coolant system, and internal seals began to deteriorate due to the excessive vibration. When she finally exposed the failed pump mechanism, the extent of the damage was immediately visible. The internal bearings had indeed failed catastrophically, just as she had predicted. Metal fragments and coolant were scattered throughout the pump housing, and the impeller shaft showed obvious signs of severe overheating and mechanical stress. "Unbelievable," muttered, examining the destroyed components. "The diagnostic systems never detected any of this wear." Captain Hayes approached the group, having completed her initial assessment of the emergency landing procedures. She looked at the failed pump components with the trained eye of someone who understood both the engineering principles and operational implications of aircraft system failures. "Santos, I owe you an apology," Captain Hayes said. "Your concerns were completely valid, and we should have taken them more seriously. Can you tell me why our monitoring systems failed to detect this problem?" Maria carefully lifted out the destroyed bearing assembly, noting the specific pattern of wear that had led to the failure. The computerized systems monitor temperature, pressure, and vibration, but they're calibrated for normal wear patterns and gradual degradation. This particular failure mode involved very subtle changes that fell below the threshold levels programmed into the diagnostic software. "So how did you detect it when our computers couldn't?" Tommy asked, genuinely curious about her methodology. Maria smiled slightly as she reached for her grandfather's old stethoscope, a tool that had seemed hopelessly outdated to her colleagues just a few hours earlier. "Sometimes the old ways work better than the new ways. This stethoscope can detect mechanical irregularities that electronic sensors miss, especially when you know how to listen for specific patterns." She demonstrated by placing the stethoscope against a similar pump on another aircraft, letting Tommy and listen to the smooth, regular sound of properly functioning bearings. Then she showed them audio recordings she had made of the failed pump, clearly documenting the progression of irregular vibrations over time. "The key is understanding that machines communicate with us constantly," Maria explained as she began removing the damaged pump from the aircraft. "They tell us when something is wrong, but we have to know how to listen and interpret what we're hearing." Colonel Park joined the group as Maria continued her analysis of the failed components. Despite having just survived a potentially life-threatening emergency, Park was calm and professional, focused on understanding what had gone wrong and how similar problems could be prevented in the future. "Santos, I want to thank you personally for trying to prevent this situation," Park said. "I know you faced resistance when you raised your concerns, but your persistence may have saved my life today." "How do you figure that, ma'am?" Maria asked, looking up from her work. "Because your warnings made me extra vigilant about the cooling system during the flight. When the first symptoms appeared, I immediately recognized them as matching your descriptions and began emergency procedures. If I hadn't been specifically watching for cooling problems, I might have attributed the initial symptoms to normal variations and lost valuable time before realizing the severity of the situation." As news of the successful emergency landing and Maria's predictive diagnosis spread through the hangar, other personnel began gathering around to observe her repair work. Word had quickly traveled that the new mechanic with the antique tools had accurately predicted a system failure that sophisticated computers had missed entirely. "All right, everyone, let's give Santos room to work," Sergeant announced. "She's got a pump to replace and an aircraft to get back to mission-ready status." Maria opened her tool bag and began laying out the equipment she would need for the repair. The replacement pump was a complex piece of machinery, requiring precise installation and careful adjustment of multiple connecting systems. It was exactly the kind of challenging repair that would test all of her training and experience. But as she began working, Maria felt completely confident in her abilities. Every tool in her grandfather's collection had been chosen for reliability and precision. The old socket wrenches turned with smooth efficiency. The worn screwdrivers fit perfectly into their designated slots, and the hand-carved wooden handles provided exactly the right feel and control for delicate adjustments. "I've never seen someone work so efficiently on a cooling system replacement," Sarah commented as she watched Maria systematically disconnect and reconnect the various components. "Usually this kind of repair takes at least 8 hours with a full team. My grandfather taught me that if you understand how something works and you use the right tools for the job, even complex repairs become straightforward," Maria replied, carefully torquing a critical connection to exact specifications. "The key is taking time to do it right the first time." As she worked, Maria explained each step of the process to the watching mechanics, sharing techniques and insights that she had learned through years of hands-on experience with mechanical systems. Her colleagues asked intelligent questions and offered to assist with various aspects of the repair, creating a collaborative atmosphere that had been missing during her first weeks at the base. "Santos, how long do you estimate until this aircraft is ready for flight testing?" Captain Hayes asked, checking the schedule implications of the extended maintenance. Maria paused in her work to assess the remaining tasks. "If I can get help with the coolant system flush and refill, I should have everything completed within the next 3 hours. Then we'll need at least 2 hours of ground testing to verify all systems before signing off on flight readiness." Tommy immediately volunteered to assist with the coolant system servicing, while began preparing the necessary testing equipment. Even Sargent pitched in by coordinating with supply personnel to ensure that all replacement parts and consumables were immediately available. The collaborative repair effort became a learning experience for everyone involved. Maria demonstrated diagnostic techniques that complemented the computerized monitoring systems, while her colleagues shared insights about F-35 specific procedures and requirements that enhanced her understanding of the aircraft's unique characteristics. When the replacement pump was finally installed, and all connections, Maria used her grandfather's stethoscope one more time to confirm that the new component was operating with the smooth, regular sound that indicated proper function. The difference between the healthy pump and the failed unit was immediately obvious to everyone who listened. "Perfect bearing sound," Tommy confirmed after listening through the stethoscope. "Smooth as silk." The ground testing phase proceeded flawlessly, with all systems showing optimal performance and no indication of any remaining problems. The aircraft's computerized diagnostics confirmed what Maria's trained ear had already told her. Everything was working exactly as designed. As the sun began to set over Edwards Air Force Base, aircraft 125052 was declared ready to return to flight status. The successful repair had been completed in record time, and Colonel Park was scheduled to conduct a test flight the following morning to verify that all systems performed correctly under operational conditions. "Santos," Sargent said, as the maintenance team began packing up their equipment, "I want you to know that your diagnostic work today was exceptional. You identified a problem that could have caused a catastrophic failure, and you completed the repair with skill and efficiency that impressed everyone here." Maria carefully cleaned and packed her grandfather's tools back into their worn leather case, each implement returning to its designated position just as it had for the past 30 years. The tools that had once seemed outdated and inadequate to her colleagues were now viewed with respect and appreciation for their proven effectiveness. "Thank you, Sergeant. I'm just glad everything worked out safely." Captain Hayes approached as Maria prepared to leave for the day. "Santos, I want to talk with you tomorrow about developing new diagnostic procedures that combine traditional techniques with our computerized systems. Your approach today has shown me that we might be missing important early warning signs by relying too heavily on automated monitoring." As Maria walked toward the parking lot, her tool bag slung over her shoulder just as it had been on her first day, she reflected on how dramatically things had changed. The skeptical glances and whispered doubts had been replaced by genuine respect and appreciation for her unique skills and perspective. Behind her, aircraft 125052 sat ready for its return to active service, its cooling system functioning perfectly thanks to her grandfather's tools and the knowledge that had been passed down through 3 generations of mechanics. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to prove that the combination of traditional craftsmanship and modern technology could achieve results that neither approach could accomplish alone. But tonight, as she drove home through the desert landscape, Maria felt the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing she had made a real difference. She had prevented a potential tragedy, earned the respect of her colleagues, and honored the memory of a grandfather who had taught her that good tools and careful attention to detail would never go out of style. The worn leather tool bag on the seat beside her no longer seemed like a relic from the past. Instead, it represented a bridge between old wisdom and new challenges, proving that some things never change in the world of mechanical problem-solving. The importance of listening carefully, thinking clearly, and having the courage to speak up when something isn't right.